The object slid across the white tablecloth at 8:58 p.m. It was a cheap, plastic baby monitor. An insult in a place like this. Victor Moretti, a man whose neck tattoos were usually hidden by expensive suits, stared at the device. He frowned at first. He thought it was a mistake. A prank. A waiter who had lost their mind. Then the waitress leaned in. She didn't apologize. She didn't pour the water. She whispered only one word. Listen. Victor's breath stilled. Through the crackling static, he didn't hear a baby crying. He heard his wife's voice. He drinks the poison at 9. Make sure the ambulance is late. Victor slowly lowered the device. He had seen betrayal before. He had punished it. But he had never seen this. The woman across from him, wearing the red dress he paid for, was smiling while she waited for him to die. He stood up. He didn't flip the table. He didn't scream. He grabbed his coat. Victor? Elena asked, her smile faltering. Where are you going? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because a 3-second recording had just destroyed his marriage and saved his life. As he walked toward the door, he realized the woman serving the water, the ex-girlfriend he exiled 3 years ago, was the only person in the room who wasn't trying to kill him. Tonight, he wasn't leaving with his wife. He was leaving with the woman he destroyed. Stay with me until the end, because what happens when they walk out those doors won't just shock the guests, it will start a war. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The obsidian room didn't smell like food. It smelled like money, old leather, and secrets whispered over $50 cocktails. Rosa Vale moved through the dim lighting with the practiced invisibility of a shadow. Her hands, once manicured and adorned with diamonds paid for by blood money, were now bare, red-knuckled, and gripping a spray bottle of disinfectant. To the senators and CEOs dining on Wagyu beef, she was furniture. A ghost in a black apron. They spoke freely around her, discussing affairs and embezzlements, never suspecting that the woman refilling their water glasses had once laundered more money in a month than they earned in a decade. 3 years ago, Rosa had been the queen of the South. She had sat at the head of the table, not wiped it down. She had been the architect of Victor Moretti's empire, the strategist who turned his brute force into political power. Then came the betrayal, the planted evidence, the exile. Victor had looked at her with eyes like glaciers and stripped her of everything. Her name, her home, her dignity. Vale. Table 4 needs resetting. Now, Carlo, the floor manager who sweated through his cheap suits by 7 p.m., snapped his fingers near her face. Rosa didn't flinch. She didn't glare. She simply nodded, her expression a mask of obedient neutrality. She walked to the host's stand to check the seating chart, her movements efficient, surgical. She tapped the screen, scrolling past the names of politicians and heirs, until her finger froze. VIP. Booth 4. Moretti, Victor. Party of 2. The air left her lungs in a sharp rush. The kitchen noise, the clatter of pans, the shouting chefs, faded into a dull roar. 3 years. She hadn't seen him since the night he threw her out. Panic, cold and primal, tried to seize her throat. She should leave. She could feign illness, slip out the back alley, and vanish into the night before he walked through those double doors. Then she saw the note attached to the reservation. Anniversary. The word twisted inside her gut like a serrated blade. It wasn't just that he was coming here. It was that he was celebrating the survival of the parasite that had infected his life. Elena. The woman who had smiled like a viper while Rosa was dragged away. The woman who was now living Rosa's life, wearing Rosa's jewels, and sleeping in Rosa's bed. Rosa looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the wine cellar. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, servant's bun. Her makeup was non-existent. She looked nothing like the woman who used to run the city. Good. Her grip on the silver tray tightened until her knuckles turned white. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, familiar clarity. The ghost wasn't going to run. If the queen had to serve the usurper, she would make sure the service was unforgettable. Rosa smoothed her apron, lifted her chin, and stepped back onto the floor. The atmosphere in the obsidian room shifted the moment the heavy oak doors swung open. It wasn't a sound. It was a drop in pressure, the kind that precedes a hurricane. The chatter died down to hushed whispers as Victor Moretti stepped across the threshold. He looked less like a man arriving for dinner and more like a soldier inspecting a battlefield. His tuxedo was immaculate, cut to hide the holster at his ribs, but unable to soften the jagged line of ink climbing his neck. He scanned the room with dead, weary eyes, the eyes of a king who no longer trusted his own court. Beside him, Elena was a slash of violence in crimson silk. If Victor was the stone, she was the blade. Her dress was a shade of red that demanded attention, clinging to curves that Rosa knew Victor hadn't touched with love in months. Elena didn't walk. She prowled, her hand resting possessively on Victor's forearm, her chin tilted high. She beamed at the terrified host, basking in the fear her husband commanded. The contrast was sickening. Victor looked like he was attending a funeral, while Elena looked like she was celebrating a victory. Rosa stood in the shadows near the service station, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She gripped a pitcher of water to steady her hands. She watched Elena lean in, whispering something into Victor's ear. Victor didn't smile. He barely nodded, his jaw set in a line of granite. As the host gestured toward the main dining floor, Elena stopped. She pulled a phone from her clutch, a device that buzzed with an urgency that didn't match her relaxed demeanor. "Go on, darling." Elena's voice carried over the low jazz, smooth and saccharine. "I just need to take this. My stylist is incompetent." Victor's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he walked on, leaving his wife alone near the VIP coat check. Rosa's instincts, dormant for 3 years, screamed. Elena Moretti didn't have a stylist problem at 8 p.m. on a Friday. She had a plan. Rosa moved. She didn't run. She flowed, merging with the dark paneling of the hallway. She knew the layout of this restaurant better than the architect who built it. As Elena stepped into the secluded alcove of the coat room, turning her back to the entrance, Rosa slipped into the adjacent service bay. Through the gap in the heavy velvet curtains, she saw Elena check her reflection in the mirror, her smile dropping instantly into a sneer of anticipation. She raised the phone to her ear. Rosa reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around the small, white plastic device she kept for checking the stockroom noise levels, a portable nursery transmitter. It was crude, but it was sensitive. With the silence of a phantom, Rosa reached through the decorative partition separating the service bay from the coat check. Her hand hovered over the massive arrangement of white orchids sitting on the marble console, just inches from Elena's elbow. She nestled the transmitter deep into the moss at the base of the flowers, the white plastic vanishing against the white petals. She pulled her hand back just as Elena began to speak, her voice low and venomous. "I'm here. Is it done?" Rosa froze, her breath caught in her throat. She backed away slowly, clutching the receiver unit against her chest. The trap was set. Now, she just had to listen. Victor sat in the curved leather booth, his back to the wall, eyes scanning the room with the rhythmic precision of a radar. He didn't relax. He never relaxed anymore. The obsidian room was designed for intimacy, high velvet backs, dim candlelight, hushed acoustics. But tonight, Booth 4 felt less like a romantic alcove and more like a holding cell. Elena slid into the seat opposite him, the red silk of her dress rustling like dry leaves. She didn't reach for his hand. She didn't apologize for the delay in the coat room. She simply picked up her wine glass, found it empty, and set it back down with a sharp clack of annoyance. "Service is slipping," she murmured, her eyes already drifting away from him. "It's a busy night," Victor said, his voice gravelly and low. He watched her. He watched the way her fingers tapped a frantic, silent rhythm on the white tablecloth. Elena didn't respond. She had pulled her phone from her clutch again, shielding the screen with a practiced tilt of her wrist. The blue light of the display cast a ghostly pallor over her face, illuminating a small, secret smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a look Victor hadn't seen directed at him in months, a look of anticipation, of excitement. "Who are you texting?" Victor asked. He kept his tone neutral, but the muscles in his jaw bunched. "Just the decorator, darling." Elena lied, not even bothering to look up. "The renovations for the summer house are a nightmare." Victor looked at her hands. They were perfectly manicured, the diamond he had bought her glittering under the track lights. She wasn't texting a decorator at 8:15 p.m. on a Friday. She was bored. She was physically present, her body draped in expensive fabric across from him, but her mind was miles away, engaged in a conversation he wasn't allowed to hear. She took a sip of water, her eyes still glued to the screen. She looked like a cat playing with a mouse that was already dead but didn't know it yet. There was an arrogance in her posture, a languid confidence that terrified him more than a gun in her hand would have. She wasn't worried about him catching her. She wasn't worried about the staff overhearing. She believed she was untouchable. Victor felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had spent his life reading people, detecting the subtle tremors of fear in a rival, the shift in gaze of a traitor. Elena wasn't afraid. She was waiting. "You look happy," Victor said, testing the water. Elena finally looked up. For a second, the mask slipped, and he saw the predator underneath. "I am," she purred, her lips curling into that knowing, dangerous half-smile. "I have a feeling tonight is going to be unforgettable." She didn't leave the table. She didn't go to the restroom. She just leaned back against the velvet, raised her phone again, and typed a message that made her eyes shine with cruel delight. She sat there, beautiful and lethal, waiting for the wine, waiting for the time, waiting for him to die. The swinging doors of the kitchen cut off the hushed elegance of the dining room, replacing it with a wall of noise. Steam hissed from the dishwasher, chefs shouted orders in rapid-fire Italian, and the smell of searing garlic was thick enough to taste. For anyone else, it was chaos. For Rosa, it was cover. She stood near the espresso station, her back to the line cooks. To the casual observer, she was just checking the coffee grinder. In reality, her hand was pressed against her ear, holding the small, cheap receiver she used to monitor the dining room service frequency. She switched channels, tuning into the frequency of the transmitter she had buried in the orchids 10 minutes ago. Static crackled, harsh and loud. Then, the audio cleared. The sound of the coat room was dead silent, amplifying the click of heels on marble and the rustle of silk. Then came the voice, distorted by distance but unmistakable in its arrogance. "I don't care about the collateral," Elena's voice hissed through the earpiece. "Just make sure the driver is ready." Rosa's breath hitched. She stared at the digital clock on the espresso machine. 8:48 p.m. "No, you idiot," Elena continued, her tone shifting from annoyance to icy command. "Not in the car. That's too messy. He drinks the toast at 9 p.m. I want it done here, in front of everyone. It sends a message." There was a pause, filled only by the hum of the kitchen refrigerators. Then came the kill shot. "The poison mimics a heart attack. Make sure the ambulance is delayed. I want him cold before they even load him onto the stretcher." Rosa ripped the earpiece out, the plastic clattering against the stainless steel counter. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer, cold reality of it. It wasn't a vague threat. It wasn't a future plan. It was happening now. "Rosa," Carlo's voice boomed across the kitchen. "Table 4. The vintage Barolo. Moretti wants it decanted now. Move." Rosa spun around. Carlo was shoving a dust-covered bottle toward her, a 1996 reserve. The kind of wine you drank to celebrate a life, or to end one. She looked at the bottle, then at the clock. 8:50 p.m. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The poison wasn't in the food. It was in the bottle. Elena wasn't texting a decorator. She was timing the toast. If that wine hit the table, Victor Moretti would be a corpse by dessert. Rosa grabbed the bottle, the glass cold against her sweating palm. She didn't decant it. She grabbed a silver tray and the receiver unit she had just used. She wasn't going to pour the wine. She was going to serve the truth. The walk from the kitchen to booth 4 was only 30 feet, but it felt like crossing a minefield. Rosa moved with a terrifying calm, the silver water pitcher heavy in her left hand, the white plastic receiver burning a hole in her right palm. The dining room was a low hum of polite conversation, a stark contrast to the screaming alarm bells ringing in her head. She kept her eyes lowered, watching the floor tiles blur beneath her feet. Every instinct she had honed during her years at Victor's side was firing at once. Calculate the angles, assess the threats, control the narrative. But tonight, she wasn't the strategist in the boardroom. She was the help. And that was her only advantage. As she approached the table, the dynamic was painfully clear. Victor sat like a man awaiting a verdict, his gaze fixed on the empty wine glass in front of him. He looked hollowed out, a king sitting on a crumbling throne. Across from him, Elena was holding a gold compact mirror, tilting her head to catch the candlelight. She was applying a fresh coat of blood-red lipstick, smirking at her own reflection. She wasn't looking at her husband. She wasn't looking for the wine. She was preening for the victory lap. Rosa stopped at the edge of the table. Elena didn't even blink. To her, Rosa was just a uniform, a non-entity arriving to perform a menial task. Water, Rosa murmured, her voice a rough whisper that barely carried over the jazz. She stepped in close, positioning her body deliberately. She placed herself squarely between Elena's line of sight and Victor's right hand, using her torso as a shield. Elena, busy admiring the arch of her brow, didn't notice the intrusion. Rosa reached out. She didn't pour the water. Instead, she opened her hand. The white baby monitor hit the black tablecloth with a soft, muted thud. It sat there, stark and alien among the crystal stemware and silver cutlery, a piece of cheap plastic in a world of diamonds. Victor's eyes snapped to it. His brow furrowed, confusion warring with irritation. He looked up, his mouth opening to reprimand the clumsy waitress, to demand why garbage was being placed on his table. Then he saw her eyes. Rosa held his gaze. She didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She looked at him with the same fierce, unyielding intensity she had worn the day she built his empire. The recognition in his eyes was slow, then instantaneous, a shockwave that turned his face pale. He looked from her face down to the device. The red light on the receiver was blinking. Rosa leaned in, just an inch, invading his personal space in a way no server ever would. She slid the monitor forward with a single finger, pushing it until it touched his hand. "Listen," she breathed. Victor stared at the white plastic box as if it were a live grenade. It was an insult, a piece of cheap nursery equipment sitting on a starch-white tablecloth, nestled between the silver forks and the crystal water glass. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck bunching beneath the ink. He looked up, ready to dismiss the incompetence, ready to demand the manager remove this trash and the waitress who brought it. But the words died in his throat. He knew those eyes. They weren't the deferential eyes of a server. They were dark, sharp, and terrified. The eyes of the only woman who had ever sat in on his war councils and told him he was wrong. Rosa. The name hit him like a physical blow, stripping the air from his lungs. She was thinner, worn down by the exile he had sentenced her to, but the steel in her gaze hadn't rusted. She leaned in, her face inches from his, the water pitcher forgotten in her hand. "Listen," she whispered. It wasn't a request. It was an order. The same tone she used to use when she caught a discrepancy in the ledgers or spotted a tail in the rearview mirror. Victor didn't ask questions. Instinct, buried under 3 years of anger and pride, took over. He reached out and picked up the monitor. The plastic felt light and hollow in his heavy hand. He raised it to his ear. At first, there was only the hiss of static, a white noise that scratched against his eardrum. Then, a voice cut through the interference with venomous clarity. "He drinks the toast at 9 p.m. I want it done here, in front of everyone." Victor's heart hammered a violent rhythm against his ribs. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice that had whispered vows to him in the cathedral. "The poison mimics a heart attack. Make sure the ambulance is delayed." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The ambient jazz, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of the other guests, it all fell away, leaving him in a vacuum of cold, absolute horror. The recording continued, a loop of calculated murder, narrated by his wife. Victor lowered the device slowly, his hand trembling with a rage so profound it felt like ice in his veins. He looked across the table. Elena snapped her compact mirror shut with a sharp click. She slipped it into her clutch and smoothed the front of her red dress, checking the time on her phone. She looked up, and for a moment, she seemed confused by the look on his face, the blood that had drained from his skin, the predator's stillness that had overtaken him. She smiled, that practiced, knowing curve of her lips that he had once mistaken for love. She reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand, oblivious to the fact that she was touching a man who had just heard her sign his death warrant. "Is something wrong, darling?" she asked, her voice dripping with counterfeit concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Ghost," he repeated internally. The word echoed in the vacuum of his mind, bouncing against the recording of his wife ordering a hearse. He looked at Elena, really looked at her. For months, he had told himself her distance was just independence, her sharpness just spirit. But now, stripping away the red silk and the diamond earrings, he saw the rot underneath. She wasn't smiling at him. She was smiling at a corpse. The realization didn't burn, it froze him. The woman he had brought into his home, the woman he had paraded as his queen, was counting the seconds until his heart stopped. She had sat across from him, breaking bread, while checking the tracking number on his death. Then his gaze shifted, past the candlelight, past the lie, to the woman standing in the shadows of the booth. Rosa. She stood with her hands clasped in front of her apron, her posture rigid. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed. She had simply walked into the line of fire and handed him the weapon to save himself. The woman he had exiled. The woman he had branded a traitor. She was the only reason he was still drawing breath. The shame hit him harder than the rage. He had thrown away a diamond to pick up a piece of broken glass. Victor's hand, still clutching the cheap plastic monitor, began to tremble. It was a microscopic movement, a vibration of pure, adrenaline-fueled shock that threatened to shatter his composure. The glass of water on the table rippled in sympathy. Elena watched the tremor, her brow furrowing slightly. She leaned forward, perhaps thinking the poison was already taking hold, her eyes brightening with predatory hope. That look killed the tremble instantly. Victor went still. It was the unnatural, terrifying stillness of a predator that has stopped stalking and is about to strike. The cords of his neck stood out, the black ink of his tattoos warping as the muscles bunched tight. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, mathematical fury. He wasn't a husband anymore. He was the boss, and he had a bill to settle. The sommelier arrived with the timing of an executioner, cradling the 1996 Barolo like a holy relic. The cork made a soft, wet pop that sounded obscenely loud in the silence between them. Victor watched the dark red liquid cascade into the crystal goblet. It swirled, rich and heavy, smelling of earth and fruit. And, thanks to the white plastic box in his hand, betrayal. The waiter filled Elena's glass, then Victor's. The service was impeccable. The trap was perfect. Elena wasted no time. She reached for the stem of her glass, her fingers trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill. She lifted the crystal into the candlelight, the ruby liquid catching the flame. Her eyes locked onto his, bright and glassy. "To us, Victor," she murmured, the words dripping with a sweetness that made his stomach turn. "To forever." Victor didn't move. His hands remained flat on the white tablecloth, framing the plate he hadn't touched. He looked at the wine, then at the woman holding it. She was waiting for him to lift his glass. She was waiting for him to swallow the end of his life so she could play the grieving widow before the check arrived. The silence stretched, turning thin and brittle. Elena's smile faltered, just a fraction. "Victor," she prompted, tilting her glass toward him. "Don't leave me hanging." Victor picked up the object in his hand, but it wasn't the wine glass. He set the baby monitor down in the exact center of the table. It sat there, an ugly, white accusation amidst the fine china. The red light on the receiver was still blinking, a rhythmic pulse in the dim light. Elena stared at it, her brow furrowed, her gaze flicking from the device to Victor's face, confusion warring with a dawning, terrible dread. Victor pushed his chair back. The legs scraped against the parquet floor, a harsh, grating sound that drew the eyes of the neighboring tables. He stood up slowly, unfolding his height until he towered over her. He buttoned his suit jacket with deliberate, calm movements, checking the cuffs, adjusting the collar. He looked like a man preparing to leave a boring business meeting, not a man walking away from his marriage. He looked down at her one last time. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply looked at the wine glass still hovering in her hand. "To you, Elena," he said, his voice flat and dead, carrying the weight of a judge's gavel. "You'll need the luck." Victor didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on the booth, on the anniversary, and on the woman in the red dress. He pivoted toward the shadows where Rosa stood, clutching the silver water pitcher like a shield. He stopped in front of her. For the first time in 3 years, he didn't look through her. He looked at her. He saw the fatigue etched into the corners of her eyes, the roughness of her hands, hands that had once signed off on millions of dollars in transfers, now chapped from scouring powder. He saw the loyalty he had been too blind to recognize, and the strength he had been too arrogant to value. "Get your coat," Victor said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of a command that would brook no argument. Rosa didn't hesitate. She set the water pitcher down on a nearby service station with a finality that echoed like a gavel strike. She reached behind her, untying the knot of her black apron. She let the fabric fall to the floor, stepping out of the uniform and the identity she had worn like a prison sentence. She wasn't the help anymore. Victor. Elena's voice cracked, rising in pitch as panic finally pierced her arrogance. Victor, wait. You can't just leave. What is this? She scrambled out of the booth, her wine glass tipping over, spilling a dark, blood-red stain across the pristine tablecloth. She reached for him, her hand grasping at the air, but she didn't dare cross the line he had drawn. She looked from her husband to the waitress, her face twisting in confusion and dawning horror. Victor didn't turn around. He placed a hand on the small of Rosa's back, a protective, possessive gesture that claimed her before the entire room. Together, they walked toward the double doors. The dining room had gone deathly silent. Guests froze with forks halfway to their mouths. Carlo, the sweating manager, stood by the host's stand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish as he watched the Don escort his floor staff out like royalty. As they pushed through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, the noise of the city rushed back in. Sirens, traffic, life. Victor stopped on the pavement. He pulled his phone from his inner pocket, his movements calm and lethal. He dialed a single number. He looked back at the restaurant, watching through the glass as Elena stood alone at the table, surrounded by the wreckage of her plot, staring at the blinking monitor. "It's me," Victor said into the phone, his eyes cold as the grave. "My wife is dining alone. Ensure she doesn't leave the building." He hung up, slipping the phone back into his pocket. He turned to Rosa, the neon lights of the city reflecting in his dark eyes. The car was waiting. The war was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Victor Moretti wasn't fighting it alone.